I have to suppress my blushing and for this calling me in this praiseful way, but I'll try at least to somehow to justify this expectation and try to present this topic in an engaging way for you, and I'll be very happy if you will interrupt me and put questions, because sometimes I speak and the speaking may disappear nowhere, and I will be very interested if what soil do my words meet in your with your presence, because it will be more interesting for me to have interaction with you. It's a topic is difficult, and we deal with certain allogism. Allogism, what is this allogism? Because we say that we Georgians are Europe. Georgia is Europe, we say. At the same time, simultaneously, we say that we aspire towards Europe. If you aspire towards something, you are not that to which you aspire. Yeah? You are aspiring to something which you lack, which you are not. At the same time, you say we are Europe. If you are Europe, you do not aspire to anything. So this is an oxymoron somehow, this allogism, but there is some wisdom in this allogism. It also deals with the idea that where basically we belong to this European civilization, we had some deviation from it, and now we want to return to this European path. So what does it mean? And how can we see this topic from a historical perspective? Because Georgians are very much historical oriented nation. We find our self-identity far in the medieval history, even earlier. Of course, one may say that it's all this is kind of fabrication and all these are invention, but anyhow, this invention, whatever it is, invention or half invention or whatever, it works. So Georgians see their identity in a very early past of their history, and this is not entirely, I would say, fabrication, of course, because you see artifacts of this ancient culture from medieval time with Georgian inscriptions even. How can you say that this is fabrication? No way it is a fabrication, but of course it was viewed in a different way in 19th century, and it was used for creation of modern Georgian nation. But still there is a huge history, recorded history of Georgians from 5th century AD, when Georgian literature and script appeared. So let me start. Also we should see when we say about our aspiration towards Europe, what is Europe and what was Europe in the Middle Ages, in antiquity, on what pillars Western civilization, European civilization is based. Of course, few of those pillars and very important pillars are Greek classical tradition with Homer, with Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, Greek philosophy, Greek democratic tradition. Of course, this another pillar is Roman political tradition, Roman legal tradition. Still another pillar is, of course, you anticipated it, Christianity, because Christianity became the part of European identity. Even today they speak about post-Christian world, postmodern or post-Christian world, but still, even the postmodernism can be based on certain things which has its beginning in Christianity. And European Renaissance and Enlightenment tradition cannot be even imagined without Christianity. So, and these three traditions are very important, and I shall try to show how Georgia's history and Georgia's history of Georgian culture is related to those pillars. Do we resonate with those pillars in our ancient history? And what relations were there with European civilization of Georgian kingdom, or of Georgian kingdoms, but because sometimes these kingdoms were divided. Of course, there is a caveat that the great Georgian writers in Middle Ages, they would not even imagine that they would aspire towards Euro integration or something. They were simply writers, and they wrote whatever they felt, and they were influenced by Oriental culture, by Byzantine culture, and by Christian culture and non-Christian culture, and it was not their aim to become a part of something. So there's a caveat that we may sometimes try to, to present them from our standpoint and in the perspective of our modern agenda. And the claim, let's say, for instance, that, I don't know, Georgia kingdom adopted Christianity in 4th century in order to unite with Europe, it will be stupid. Of course not. I mean, but that's why one should not treat history in such a wrong way as not to respect it in its own terms and use it for your own modern agenda, for nation making or something. I hate such things. Of course, you cannot escape this part of history, but history is still a science, and you need objectivity, some spirit of objectivity to address the history. So let me try to do this impossible task to address history in an objective way and not to deviate with modern day, let's say, agenda, and also to do this impossible task to present Georgian historical overview in this short time, because there are so many problematic points and so many nuances which I cannot touch now, but I will present some general overview, and you are welcome to ask some specific questions, and then I can go to details as well, okay? So, so far so good. Do you have any questions? No? Okay. So, let's speak about early times of Georgian kingdom. So early times, let's start from 3rd century BC, before Christ. So it's a time when first Georgian kingdom appeared there. It was Georgia became part of Hellenistic empire of Alexander of Macedonia, and Alexander, according to Georgian historical annals, sent his troops to govern Georgia, and these troops were governed by a general called Azon. He was a very cruel guy, and the Georgians revolted against him under a certain guy, nobleman Parnavas. And Parnavas thus became first king of Georgia. And at the same time, there was in western Georgia a ruler called Kuji, and Kuji submitted himself to Parnavas' rule. So even in 3rd century, there was some unitary kingdom in a way, because there was domination of Parnavas over the western Georgian ruler, Kuji, who submitted to him. So the Parnavas is told to introduce Georgian, bookish culture, so writing culture in Georgia. Of course, Georgian alphabet did not exist at that time. It means that Parnavas simply used some other languages, some other script for administrative purposes. And what script do you see in Tsketa, in the capital of Georgia, in the excavations of this, which relate to this Hellenistic time? This is Aramaic and Greek. So Georgian kingdom was under Parnavas. Parnavas himself was of Persian origin, his name shows it, but the Georgian kingdom was not Persian, but rather more Hellenistic, Hellenized Persian empire, Hellenized Persian kingdom, because you don't see any Persian inscriptions there. You see Aramaic inscriptions and Greek inscriptions. These inscriptions are found in the, let's say, in epitaphs, gravestones, and it's not only inscription, but it also shows some Hellenistic rhetorics also of those inscriptions. For example, we have this beautiful Armazi bilingual epitaph on a girl who died at 20 years of age. Girl died of noble girl, and there is this inscription in a very high style that she was daughter of this and this nobleman, and she was maiden of unspeakable beauty who died at 20 years of age. So they use even this Hellenistic rhetoric in these gravestones. So you see that Georgian kingdom from the outset was part of a larger Hellenistic world, which was created by Alexander of Macedonia. Of course, later you see this in adoption of Christianity, which was a Roman religion. So Christianity was called by Georgians religion of Romans. Before Christianity was adopted as a state religion in Georgia, religion for Georgians was Zoroastrianism, some form of Zoroastrianism. You read the life of Saint Nino, who converted Georgia to Christianity from Zoroastrianism, that she fought against this idol Armazi. And Armazi is a Georgianized form of Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda means wise lord, is Zoroastrian chief deity. So Georgians erected some idol of Ahura Mazda called Armazi, and Ninos destroyed this idol. So this, by adoption of Christianity, Georgia consciously chose its orientation towards Rome rather than Persia. So Georgian kingdom itself, the first dynasty, as I told you, were Persian by blood. Even first Christian kingdom, Miriam, in 4th century, Christianity was adopted as a state religion in 326. Georgia is a second or third nation adopting Christianity. Like first is Armenia. Armenia claims to become Christian in 300, in the year 300. Then was Georgia or Ethiopia. So there's a quarrel between Georgians and Ethiopians, who is the second earliest Christian kingdom. So in Georgians, when Miriam adopted Christianity, initially he was afraid of adopting this religion because he was afraid of retaliation from Persia. Adopting religion at that time meant political orientation. You are adopting Roman religion, religion of Constantine the Great. That means that you are adopting the political allegiance towards this Roman Empire, towards Greeks, as sometimes they are called. But that's why initially it's written that King Miriam meditated even to kill Nino, because she was dangerous politically. Eventually something happened there. This hagiography speaks about miracles, and then Miriam decided to adopt Christianity. So Georgia became Christian kingdom. And as such, Christianity is an interesting religion, because when I have spoken already that Renaissance and Enlightenment cannot be imagined without Christianity, I mean this, that religion of Christianity is not religion of rituals. It's not religion of some set laws. Christianity is religion of spirit, Holy Spirit. That means that there are no set laws, but in any instance of life, you have to decide for yourself. That letter kills, spirit vivifies. So it invites you to free reasoning. So there is some virus of freedom already there in Christianity when Paul says that we don't have laws, we are people of spirit. And we follow the spirit. And what spirit says to you, you have to decide it for yourself. So Christianity necessarily invites you to free reasoning. Of course, this virus was not activated in Middle Ages, but there was this virus in the very text of Gospel. In Middle Ages, this was not activated. It was more a tradition of pious obedience by the masses of people who were illiterate. Yes, but in the very text, this was there. And in Georgia, since this text, Indifference from Latin Christianity, was translated in vernacular Georgian from early ages, so it was available, this text, at least to nobility. So nobility read this text by themselves. They didn't need the mediation of church to read this text. Already in early Middle Ages, you have evidence that nobility starts to read gospel on their own, and church has to react on that. And they had issued a decree that noblemen are not allowed to teach gospel according to their understanding. They first should come to bishops and communicate their findings to bishops, and then bishops will spread it if there is anything good in their interpretation. But there was this tradition of, I would say, laic interpretation of gospels already in early Middle Ages in Georgia, which was what Luther did in Germany, yes, after Gutenberg's printing revolution. Then when he translated into German the Latin Bible, and the Bible was available to ordinary laymen, and they could figure out for themselves what was written there, without mediation of some body of theologians. So Georgians, after adopting Christianity, they consciously, and after creating this writing, they consciously started to relate themselves to Byzantine world, the Roman world, Christian oikumene, like larger Christian world. Creation of writing, what does it mean, creation of writing? Creation of writing is that you have an ability of self-reflection already. You can write about yourself. For instance, a 6th or 7th century historian Joanne writes about King Vakhtang Gorgasali, the one who founded Tbilisi. That Vakhtang Gorgasali was of Persian origin, and that once Persian king, the Persian Shah, asked him to help him against Byzantines. And Vakhtang had a dream, vision, in which he saw that if he does it, if he helps Persians against Byzantines, he will commit a mortal sin, because he will fight against his co-religionists, the Greeks. So Vakhtang refused to fight with Persians, with his blood relatives, against Byzantines, and said that first you have to fight against me, and then you can go to fight Byzantines, Romans, because they are my Christian brethren. And then he was killed in this battle against Persians. And his last words were for Georgians, Georgians love Greeks. So it was his testament word, last word. What does it mean? Did it really happen? Of course, this battle happened, he died, but did it really happen, what Joanne relates, that king said that Georgians love Greek, and was this dream true? I mean, who cares? Of course, it's a very serious matter when Joanne writes it. It doesn't matter whether it was objective or not, but what he writes about is objective in the sense that it creates objective some reality, because Georgians, it not only self-reflect, not only reflect about themselves who they are, but they also, through scripture, through writing about themselves, they create themselves. They can create themselves through writing about themselves, through figuring out this we are. So yes, our dynasty is Persian, but religious affinity is more important than this blood affinity. And this serious and strong message is conveyed by Joanne, King Vakhtang's historian, in this writing. And on this writing, generations of Georgians are raised. And they know already that religious affinity is more important. Already 5th century AD, no, 6th century AD, you have rhetorical presence of Greek rhetorical schools in Georgia. In Western Georgia, in Fasis, you have this Greek rhetorical school. What does mean Greek rhetorical school? They study there Plato, Aristotle, Homer, this florilegium of Greek poets. And one of the greatest Byzantine rhetoricians and writers, Himerius, who writes in his letter that I have studied in somewhere in Norway, in Poti, but if you are a good guy, if you are a diligent student, you can get education even in such remote places like Georgia, like Poti, Pazis Academy. So I studied all rhetorics and all philosophy, all Greek culture in the House of Muses, which was in Poti. So in Georgia, you could see this presence of very strong Hellenic education as well, from very early ages. And again, then education in Byzantium itself transferred to monastic schools, to monasteries. And in Georgia, since 6th century, proliferated monastic culture. And so monasteries became houses of learning, houses of copying the book, scriptoria, and in different monasteries were built not only in Georgia, but they were built outside Georgia as well. So monasteries were places where Georgians could communicate with other Christian cultures. There were Georgians monks in international monasteries in Palestine. There's a great monastery of Mar Saba, Saint Saba's monastery from 5th century, where there was a Georgian community of monks. Georgians had their own monasteries in Palestine. 29 monasteries, Georgian monasteries, are in Palestine from early centuries. And in these monasteries, Georgians communicated with best of the Christian culture which was available at that time. They translated everything of available in Greek and Syriac and Armenian Christian literature. All genres of Christian literature. Homiletics, ascetical writings. Homiletics means sermons. Hymnography, hagiography. They create their own Christian literature. The Georgian local saints appeared there, so they didn't read only saints of other nations, and like saints of early Roman centuries of persecution of Christians, but they have their own local saints who died by persecution of first Zoroastrian Iran, then by persecution of Arabic Caliphate. And you'll see in these writings also that Georgians identify themselves with a greater Christian culture. For instance, in 8th century writing of John of Sabas, John, the son of Sabas, his name is, he wrote Martyrdom of a young boy called Abo, who came from Baghdad, At that time, Georgia was occupied by, Georgian kingdom was occupied by Arabic Caliphate, and this young man who was alchemist, who was a perfumer, and perfumery was part of alchemy at the time. He was a scientist, an experimentator of different chemical things, and he came to Georgia. And then he got interested into Christianity. He was 17 years old or 18 years old, and then he adopted Christian faith. And he was martyred in Tbilisi. There is a church of St. Abo near Metechi's church, at the bottom of Metechi church. So she was martyred here. And the historians call him that, he found the true faith in this kind of corner of the world. So utmost corner of the world. So why this hagiographer calls Georgia utmost corner of the world? Because for him the kind of enlightened world, enlightened by Christianity, is this world of Europe and Byzantium, and we are the utmost corner because beyond Georgia there is no Christianity anymore. So they relate themselves to Constantinople. Center of the universe is Constantinople, the capital of the empire, Christian empire, and only one city and one capital city, one imperial city, and where a Christian emperor sits, that is the center of the world. That's why when Georgians go to Constantinople, they say that we go to Second Jerusalem, to the great center of Christianity. And Georgian kings also relate themselves to Constantinopolitan emperors. They call themselves Kuropalates. We are kind of welcome in emperor's palace, and we are Kyrios, its emperor. We are Kuropalati, we are those who are welcome in emperor's palace. We are just kings, and there is only one emperor in Constantinople. But we are part of this larger Christian oikumene. So, any questions? Just please feel free, and I'll feel more at home with you when you'll ask me some questions. Any questions? No? Not much. Okay. So this was Christian literature, all genres of Christian literature translated into Georgian, of course, Bible and liturgical literature, everything. But Georgians somehow were more creative in certain sense than Byzantines. Byzantines had a kind of an arrogance. They are like best culture. They are Hellenic culture, Christianized Hellenic culture. They have Plato, Aristotle, they have all these kind of great rhetoricians, and they are number one in the world. So they do not have to open their eyes to something new. But Georgians are kind of newcomers into this world of literacy somehow. And they're interested in everything. And they also are interested in Oriental literature, which Byzantines are less so. And Georgians try to translate some Oriental literature into their language and also translate from Georgian into Greek. For instance, Georgians translated in 9th century Life of Buddha. It was Persians made a Christianized version of Life of Buddha, as if Buddha was a Christian saint of 4th century. But it's, of course, Buddha. And Georgians translated into Georgian. And then in 11th century, Georgians translated it into Greek. And from Greek it spread to Latin world because Latins translated into Latin. And that's how Buddha became part of a calendar of Catholic Church and Orthodox Church. Now, even now, you have Buddha sneaked into calendars through Georgian translation of 11th century. You have now Saint Jodasap, who was in fact Saint Buddha. Anyhow, Georgians were like interested people. Like Europe means eyes wide open. It's a Greek etymological. Europe means eyes wide open. So Europe must be interested civilization. In this sense, Georgians were more Europeans than Byzantines because Georgians were with eyes wide open with curiosity. So they were somehow bridge between Oriental culture and Western culture. Also, as I told you, Georgian became very much part of Byzantine world. If you see Georgian churches, medieval churches, frescoes, all this is Byzantine culture in a Georgian, in Georgian specificity, with Georgian specificities. But Georgians also developed certain rivalry against Byzantines. And you see that they rivaled them in architecture. Georgians created different style of architecture. They knew that we should not swallow by Byzantine culture. We are using this culture. It's a great culture, but we are developing our own forms. And you see these own forms in everything, in paintings, in writings, in architecture. And this rivalry had also political dimension, because Byzantines always tried to oppress Georgians politically. And that's why Georgians were trying to find some ways to establish connections with West and Latin West, with whom Byzantines were also always in a great clash. There was a big religious clash after 1051 when Bishop of Constantinople, Carolarius, and Cardinal Humboldt cursed each other, and there was a first big split of churches of Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. And Georgians at that time played some kind of roles of mediators in a way, because Georgians were not so hostile towards Latin West. When a Georgian monk, George of Mount Athos, because in Mount Athos in Greece there was a Georgian monastery, was asked, what's the difference between Latin faith and our faith? Emperor of Byzantium asked Georgian monk. And George of Mount Athos answers that there is no difference in essence. So you're quarreling about trifles. So it's not essential difference. There is customary differences. And these theological differences can be reconciled. So he thinks that some developments in the Byzantine Church happened because of certain heresies. That's why Byzantine theology adopted certain kind of features which Latin theology does not have. But this does not mean that these two theologies are in clash. They can be reconciled. And he tries to show these ways of reconciliation. That means Georgians try to mediate between these two, Byzantines and Latins even. And Georgians, since they were searching some allies among Latins, they built for Latins monastery in Mount Athos on their own money. So Georgians invited Latin monks and built monastery for them, and then there was a big friendship of Benedictine Latin monks and Georgian monks. And this was also a political thing, because Georgians wanted to protect themselves from Byzantine intrusions on their property, on their monastic property, and not only monastic property, but also on their lands, because Byzantines rivaled Georgians, and they often took this territory in Tau-Klarjeti, which was a borderline territory between Georgians and Byzantines. So there was a huge political religious issues, and Georgians, feeling themselves part of Byzantine larger culture, still tried to find some ways to Western Europeans as well. And you have these evidences, especially in this Mount Athos friendship of Georgian monks and Latin monks, when there was a general hostility of Byzantine monks against them. Now, I want to speak about one very important thing which unites Georgian culture to European culture. That's a philosophy, Greek philosophy. So Georgians started to translate philosophical texts, Aristotelian logic from 11th century. And you see these new developments when in Gelati school, Gelati is a philosophical school in Kutaisi, maybe you have been there already, I don't know, in excursion or you will go there. So in Gelati school they developed philosophy as a kind of a discipline on its own terms. For instance, such great philosopher Joanne Petrici, on whom I work already for many years, I'm preparing an English translation of Petrici's major work now. He translated Greek philosophers and commented upon them. And he found in philosophy some independent way of soul towards ultimate reality. And he became a very dangerous figure for church, because church claimed that kind of monopoly towards ultimate reality is in church and through church. But Petrici was not saying it explicitly, so to say that you have to read Plato and not to go to liturgy. It's not Petrici, and he would not agree with it probably. But the method he provides, this dialectical method, that dialectics, logic, is a way to ultimate reality. You can engage in dialectics and elevate your soul from visible and the transient reality to the invisible and eternal, intransient reality. And that you can do independently by your own action of your own spirit, action of your own dialectical powers. And he became dangerous and was persecuted. First in Byzantium, in Constantinople, and then he was persecuted also in Georgia. But he created a tradition of independent thinking. It is called by Georgian scholars a Georgian Renaissance of 12th, 13th century. And it's a correct term, in fact, because you see the very Renaissance style of reasoning in Petrici, in Shota Rustaveli. You heard about Shota Rustaveli's poem, yes, epic poem. And it's not just a romantic poem about heroes and knights vanquishing some evil powers and rescuing some princess, and this marriage is the end of this happy end of the story. No, it's a very deep philosophical poem, and it's a poem about birth of a new personality. It's a poem about how a person can be creator of values. Rustaveli was Patrici's disciple because he uses Patrici's philosophical terminology all the way through. And what is this idea of Rustaveli? There is some kind of givenness of your culture, givenness of values, some social values, religious values, and then you have to deal with those values independently, and you can somehow develop your own values through your own emancipation of your own reasoning. That's why all this going out from your country, wandering in the desert, thinking for yourself, and coming back and saying something new, and revolting against your culture, your setting. It's a symbolic way to express it. You are a free personality, and you are the origin of values in yourself. You are not following inertia of tradition, but you are there obliged to create your own values in the light of truth, in the light of your own experiences. And that's what Patrici and Rustaveli are up to. So these are very philosophical and Weltanschauung, so to say, world outlook poem. And also what Patrici does is his philosophy the same. He speaks that you have to discover first in yourself this kernel of dignity. And what is this kernel of dignity? When you yourself sincerely think this is right, this is wrong, and you follow sincerely the logic. When you discover this principle of dignity in yourself, then you deal with everything. You deal with biblical text even, you deal with church tradition. Without yourself discovering first this principle of dignity, then nothing is yet clad with value. So you are the one who give value to everything when you discover this inner light within yourself. So this is kind of an idea of Georgian Renaissance, which term is coined by Shalom Utsubidze, a great scholar of 20th century. But it's a very correct term, I think. Now, I spoke about this golden era, the 12th century, 13th century, when Georgia was a huge kingdom with flourishing culture. But then, unfortunately, this catastrophe happened, this scourge of history. And you understand what it is, of course. Yes, in the 13th century, these Mongols came. Do you have any questions? I will pause a little bit, because maybe you have some things to ask. Because there is a big gap between some dark ages started when Mongols came in 13th century, yes? So before we continue, just if you have some questions. You're welcome to interrupt me.
Just a short question. Please. Actually, you speak about Georgians, but do you actually refer to Iberia or?
It's a good question actually, because Georgian kingdom, Georgian kingdom was kingdom of Iberia, yes, and there was a Western Georgian kingdom of Abkhazia. So kingdom of but they got united in 11th century. So and there was one kingdom of Bagrationi, and of course it's an anachronism to call it Georgian kingdom. Yes, it's anachronism. We use these anacronyms at schools, but it was kingdom of Bagrationi. Better to say, Bagrationi were claiming that there are kings over Georgians, Abkhazians, at a certain moment Armenians, and so they were devoid of any ethnic, affinity, because they were saying that we are Jews, we are descendants of David and Solomon. So they were seriously taking it that they're blood relatives of David and Solomon. They were drawing some lineages from David, Solomon, then some biblical figures, and then they come to some historical figures, and then they appear Georgian kings also. So by this they created a certain idea that they, Bagrationi, have the exclusive right to rule over this territory. So they have the right from the Bible itself. Because they are relatives of Jesus even. Because, of course, Jesus had no siblings and Jesus had no children, but Jesus was of the lineage of David. And that's why since Bagrationi dynasty is of the lineage of David, they are also brother relatives of God, because Jesus is part of this lineage as well. That's why this idea was created there to provide themselves with exclusive rule over Georgians. But there was some truth in the sense that they might have been from Palestine, they might have been Jews. Even Armenian sources of 6th century, Moses Khorenatsis says that they were taken to Caucasus by Tigranes the Great, Armenian king, in 1st century AD. So there could be some truth that they are from Palestine, and they could be Jews. Of course, this is a difficult issue. Is Abkhaz kingdom, was it ethnically Abkhaz kingdom or not? So Abkhazians now claim that it was ethnically Abkhaz kingdom. But it's very questionable. Because since the 11th century, this was one kingdom, and this kingdom used Georgian language as its political and cultural language. There is no Abkhazian language as a language of culture. All church inscriptions in Abkhazia in Middle Ages, these are either Greek or Georgian, all medieval inscriptions. All writings which were produced in Abkhazia are in Georgian, like Gospel of Mokwi of 13th century, I guess it's written in Georgian, and in Bedia Monastery, all inscriptions of chalices and wall paintings is with Georgian inscriptions. So at least this was a language of culture, lingua franca. This was used in 19th century, this fact, in an ethnocentric way, of course, and at that time Georgian nation builders claimed that all those artifacts, since they bore Georgian inscriptions, were the property of only Georgian, ethnically Georgian culture. But I think simply in Middle Ages, Georgian language was a lingua franca of many nations living in this territory, many ethnicities. The dominant ethnicity could be Georgian, yes, but also other ethnicities were there. Abkhazians were there, and they all felt themselves part of one big kingdom. As yet, the ethnicity was not so protruded as later it became. Not only 19th century, even before, but still in early Middle Ages, ethnicity was not so much protruded. Ethnicity was defined more in terms of religion. Because in 9th century, in historical writings, you read that wherever Georgian is used as a language of liturgy, this place is Georgia. So Georgian territory was defined as a territory in which Georgian language is used as a language of church service. But again, of course, to say Georgian kingdom, it's kind of anachronism, yes. It's a later anachronism. It's more a kingdom of Bagrationi. Whose language was Georgian? Who were kings over different ethnicities in Georgia? Was my question somewhat satisfying? Okay, thank you. Yeah, please.
I have another question, just to link what you said before, related to, so in that age, from the 9th to the 1st and to the 2nd,
yeah.
In the Middle Age was the period in which you described that Georgian language was being used for translate Eastern document like Buddha or like suppose other fantasy story from Persia to the Greek using the Georgian as a translated.
Yeah.
And exactly in Europe, in that stage was the same period in which before printing, the monastery copy and translate from Greek to Latin.
Yeah, scholasticism.
It was not the conscience of Europe, because we probably in Europe at that age we are every 50 kilometers in a different little kingdom, little prince, or especially in Italy, because we are a very newcomer country compared with other France or other European countries. But was a period in which, as you said for Georgia, Latin identified the area in which the Catholic power, let me use the wrong word, power, can identify one identity, like territorial. For sure in the south, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, I'm not that, I don't know, but for sure in the south, even in translate from Latin to
Uh,
Georgian? Only from so the translation was only from east to west, or also from west to?
Georgians in the early Middle Ages did not translate. Georgians did not translate from Latin. They did not know Latin. Actually, they befriended these monks from Calabria, from Amalfi. Actually, not from Amalfi. This was this Benedictine monks, and they gave them money to build monastery near Georgian monastery, and they communicated. But we do not know on what language they communicated. Probably Greek. Yeah, because these monks from Calabria, they knew Greek. So this was very much Greek-oriented culture in Italy. And that's why Georgians did not know Latin very well, but they knew some Latin theology through them, and they were close to, for instance, St. George, when he speaks about Latin theology and Byzantine theology. He even says that Byzantine theology needs this kind of developments, additional things, because they have fallen so many times in heresies. Whereas Latin and Georgian churches do not need these additional things, because we do not have the same heresies. And that's why we are simpler than Byzantines. This doesn't mean that they are enemies with each other. So they try to understand this Latin theology in a less hostile way than Byzantines, because they didn't have any political clash with Latin West. That's why they try to see this Latin theology from a more objective point of view, and try to reconcile these two things. But they did not translate from Latin until 18th century, when Sultan Saba Orbeliani went to diplomatic mission to the Western Europe, seeing a French king and Roman Pope, and then he translated also Latin theology into Georgian, and he himself became for some time Catholic, for which he was punished here. And anyhow, Georgians were not translating from Latin because of not knowing a language. It was difficult. But on the other hand, they really were bridges between these two cultures, Eastern and Western culture. And Rustaveli, for instance, he knows very well Christian culture, he knows church fathers, he knows Neoplatonic literature and Platonic Aristotelian teachings, but at the same time he knows very well Persian literature and Persian mystical tradition, the Sufi tradition. When you read 19 Panther Skin, 19 Tiger Skin, you see these two things, Oriental and Western, are creating something totally new. It's very Renaissance what he does there. But Georgians wanted to know more about Latin West. Even in 11th century, there were Georgian monks who wanted to go to Spanish Iberia. So they thought that since Byzantines called Georgia Iberia, and also there was another Iberia, Georgians said that there are our relatives living there, let's go to Spain. But this was two monks were very influential monks. They wanted to go to Spain, but these monks were representatives of Georgian kings. And that's why Byzantine emperor forbade them to go to Spain, because he thought that maybe there is some diplomatic mission also which will be against Byzantine. So there were some political issues there as well. But Georgians tried to go to West, but at that time it was very difficult. But you see great closeness of Georgian monks in Palestine with Crusaders. For instance, you see there is this text called Agapi. Agapi means when you are mentioning somebody in your prayer, list. And these Agapis of Georgians, you see the Crusaders are mentioned there. Some Ludwig, somebody, and Lord mentioned in your kingdom the Templar, somebody. So they were in good relations with Knight Templars as well, and these kind of things. You see this very animated connections and interrelations of Georgians in Palestine with Latins, and I think it's possible that Rustaveli is also connected with this troubadour culture of Crusaders, because once I was asked at a conference in England, when I related this theory of eros, this personal romantic eros in Rustaveli in 13th century, this Belgian professor asked me a question: Was he connected somehow with troubadours, with Western poets? And it's quite possible that Rustaveli himself traveled a lot. He must have been in Palestine because we have his fresco in Monastery of Holy Cross as a layman kneeling there. Probably he donated some money to this monastery. And he could have been open to these influences from the West. And that's why on his poem you might think about Western influences. This question is not studied very well, but it deserves to be studied. Actually, very interestingly, in Georgian, word for book is Latin. Word for book in Georgian is tsigni. And tsigni comes from Latin signum, like sign. Yeah. And I don't know how it can happen that we have this Latin word for it. Yeah, and
sorry, can I ask a question about the alphabet?
Yeah.
Does it have any links to the Greek?
Of course, it is based totally on Greek. I mean, it's a Georgian. The creator of Georgian alphabet had the Greek as its model, not shapes of letters, but sequence of.
Also about the letters, that would be the second part of my question, because they are so unique.
Yeah.
So how it was created really?
It was shapes of letter. Like it's very, very indigenous. So it was created. As I told you, it's a shape of letters. I mean, you mean modern Georgian shapes? It's different. It came from 12th century, but earlier shapes are more angular. These are like softer lines, and these developed like probably by Arabic influence in 12th century. It's called layman style. Lake style, and there was ecclesiastic style, and also most ancient style was uncial letters. Only uncial letters, only capital letters were there in most ancient style of Georgian script. Then these minuscules developed, literate letters, and then this layman style developed in 12th century. So we have three types of Georgian script. But the sequence of letters are based totally on Greek. Like alpha in Greek was number 1, and the Greeks also had these numerals by letters. So IA was 1, B was 2, gamma was 3, and so on and so on. So Georgian follows exactly the Greek sequence of letters. But Georgian has more letters than Greek, more sounds. And these specific Georgian sounds were put between K, this chi, in Greek letter chi, like Christos, it's from chi, and omega. So after chi, in Greek follows omega, the last letter. But in Georgian, there is a chi, k in Georgian, and then there is a specific Georgian letter squeezed between omega and chi. So Georgian omega is ohi, the last letter, but between chi, k, and omega are squeezed specific Georgian letters. Why not so that they would follow Greek until omega and then add Georgian letters? Why not so? Because they have to translate Apocalypse, a biblical word. Why? Because Georgians have to translate the book of Revelation. In book of Revelation, Jesus calls himself, I am Alpha and Omega. So Georgians have to translate this text, therefore they have to put omega in the last. First and last, Alpha and Omega. Because the very alphabet became influenced by Christianity in this way. Also, Georgian letter for cross, the first letter for cross is Jvari, and Ju is anagram of Jesus Christ, like Ieso Christe makes Jvari, so Ieso Christe, Jesus Christ makes cross, and the letter for Ju is anagram of Jesus Christ. So about script, there are different theories. There is Armenian theory of Mesrop Mashtots, that Armenians, men of letters, Mesrop Mashtots created Armenian, Georgian, Albanian alphabet, but it's contestable. I heard recently a presentation by an Austrian scholar who claims that Georgian alphabet probably was created not from top to down, but in Palestinian monastic circles. Whereas Armenian script was created from top to down, it was ordered by king, and then Mesrop created it. So it's different theories are going on. But both Armenian and Georgian script follow Greek, but Georgian alphabet follows Greek more consistently. In Armenian, there is some discrepancy of letters. They do not coincide with Greek numerals, but in Georgian, it's more consistently adjusted to Greek numerals and Greek sequence of letters. The earliest found monument is in 5th century Jerusalem, in Monastery of Holy Cross. There is mosaic inscription of Georgian inscription, the most ancient finding. In Georgia itself, most ancient sample of Georgian script is from Bolnisi, 6th century. So, should I continue or any other questions? Yeah. Okay, no problem. Any more questions? Okay, you may, if you have some questions hatching in your head and not yet hatched, you can put it out afterwards. So after that, we have this long period of, we call it Dark Ages, when Mongols came in Georgia. They devastated Georgia, and Georgia was devastated also later by Tamerlan. And at that time, Georgians, the best they could do was not to develop so much culture as before, but simply to retain their identity as Christians. We have many Georgian martyrs defending their faith. We have these battles against Persians and against later against Ottomans. So this kind of heroic period of Georgia, but from the point of view cultural development, we call it Dark Ages. Even when you see this poetry of Georgian noblemen and Georgian kings at the time are so much influenced by Persian models, Persian poetry. Not in essence, but in form at least. So Georgians imitate Persian forms of poetry. Essentially, they are Christian poems. For instance, Teimuraz writes martyrdom of his grandmother Ketevan, who was martyred by Shah Abbas, Iranian Shah, for not accepting Islam. She was tortured and martyred. And he writes a long poem about her grandmother as a martyr, but the poem itself is in a very Persian, how to say, style. So this king himself was writing in a very Persian way, and writing that Persian language is so sweet, and the Persian sweetness of Persian language invited him to become a poet. So you have this very much Oriental formal influence of Georgian literature at that time. But later, what happened later, from 18th century, you have new wavings, the new kind of new ideas are coming to fore. We have this David Guramishvili, a wonderful intellectual and poet who was exiled in Prussia. He was in Germany, and then he was in Ukraine, and he tried somehow to Europeanize, in a way, Georgian verse, and not with Persian tones and Persian music, but with already some European folk style. He was listening to Polish music, to Polish songs, Russian songs, Ukrainian songs, and tried to give to Georgian verse the similar rhythm, and creating these Georgian songs according to those models. But that was not only formal influence, but he also, how to say, religious and Weltanschauung, the worldview influence, because he tried to democratize Christianity. Before him, Christianity in Georgia was very stratified. There were these theologians, very lofty religious poets who could not be understood. They wrote in a very highfalutin, lofty way, and inaccessible to ordinary people, to peasants for sure, inaccessible. Very difficult embroidery of religious symbols, which only specialists now can understand. And only very highly religious people in monasteries could understand this kind of religious culture. But Guramishvili is creating a democratic Christian culture, probably influenced by the things which he saw in Prussia when he was exiled there. And his way of Christianity is also very much, he's Orthodox, remains Orthodox, but his way of Christianity is very much Protestant, because he claims that you should have this personal relationship with God, with Lord. You should have these more simpler prayers to Him, not too much stratification of the heavenly world with the world of saints. He mentions only Trinity, Mary, and then there are you. There is no hierarchy of saints as what it was before in the medieval style of Christianity. So he creates new model of democratic Christianity and puts Christian prayers in a more democratic verse that makes available this religious culture to plebs and to ordinary people as well. So for him it's kind of a reform of Georgian intellectual life for Gigineishvili. He was not so much known in Georgia because he wrote all his poems and all his didactic things abroad in Ukraine, and his manuscripts were not spread in Georgia, but at least this was his large program, educational program. From 18th century, you see Georgian nobility interested in European culture, Enlightenment culture. We have Georgian Voltairians, even royal family, they have this interest in Voltaire and French enlighteners. A Georgian king, penultimate Georgian king, for instance, he had this Latin envoys of Latin Pope in his court, and he asked this the Padre Retaliation, this Latin priest, please speak with my son, David, because he's so much into Voltaire. He doesn't go to church liturgies. He reads Voltaire and French enlighteners. And this Padre Retaliation responds, but you have your own priests and let them speak to him, this Orthodox priest. And he said, no, Padre, you are this from Rome, and he will listen to you more carefully because he will believe more to you as an enlightened man from the West than to them, because they are not so much versed in this Latin culture. When he will see that even from the West there is a strong believing man, he will have some antidote against Voltaire, and maybe he will throw away Voltaire's book and read religious literature. So you see, even in a royal family, there is this interest in Enlightenment, Western Enlightenment. And Georgians had a very difficult choice, political choice, on the verge of 2 centuries, 18th and 19th century, because Georgian kingdom was oppressed by Persian Empire, this Eastern Georgian kingdom, of course, and in order to survive, Georgians were looking for allies. In the West also, King Heraclius II, penultimate king, wanted to find some ways of getting help from French king. He asked even money for building a Georgian army, promising some things, of course, as an exchange. But he could not get any help from the West. West was very far away. The only way for Georgians to survive as a Christian nation, as King saw it at that time, was to establish connection, a political connection with Russia, Russian Empire. Of course, a little kingdom establishing political connection with such a great empire, it's not proportionate, of course. It's not on the same terms. You give up parts of your political freedom. And Georgians had to do this in order to survive as a political nation. Even more, the ultimate king of Georgia saw that Russia will not be satisfied with only protectorate of Georgia. They will really protect Georgia only if Georgia becomes full-sail part of Russian Empire, without kingdom anymore continuing. So, and he had to make this very difficult decision and thinking about already that maybe Georgia becomes part of Russian Empire, full sail. And then we may have chance to survive as a Christian nation. Again, this Western envoy of Pope, this Retaliation, tells him that, King, don't do this to your nation, because you are a loving father of your nation. Russian emperor will become kind of a angry and evil stepfather. He will not regard your people with love, and he will exploit them, assimilate them. But then king answers, our last king, I know this, Padre, but without this, Persians will swallow us and Christianity will be perished in this country. So Christianity was so much part of Georgian identity that king decided to save this identity even at the expense of political freedom. Now we say that Russia annexed Georgia at the time. In a way, you can say this, but it's not entirely so. Already king sent a letter to Russian emperor saying that asking him to unite Georgia, that Georgia may become part of Russian province. But with this, Georgian nobility was not in agreement, and it was met with a feeling of tragedy by a lot of Georgian noblemen, and they revolted against Russian rule many times. Also, other pretenders or other competitors for Georgian king's throne, they were also against Georgia becoming part of Russian Empire as a province. So they also revolted against king's decision. But eventually, these Russians came to Georgia and we became part of Russian Empire. This was, of course, a tragedy from political point of view, but at the same time, this opened the way to European education for Georgians. They could go to St. Petersburg, read European literature in original, learn French, learn German, translate philosophy, write books about European philosophy. We had a great scholar, Solomon Dodashvili, in the beginning of 19th century, who read and translated Immanuel Kant and wrote his first textbook of logic of Immanuel Kant, which was used in entire Russian Empire. Dodashvili's textbook on Immanuel Kant's logic. And Dodashvili created also a new school in Georgia, saying to Georgians that now this school in Tbilisi will be best school ever in Georgia, because even in Gelati school we didn't have that which we have now, because now we have direct access to European culture, to European philosophers, and we can teach the best thing happening in the world, the most progressive things. His disciple was a great poet, Nicholas Baratashvili, whose monument you probably have seen in Tbilisi. It's Baratashvili Bridge, and there is a monument. And you see Baratashvili's poetry is patently European poetry. He speaks in his poetry a lot about your personal action of your soul. Like in Immanuel Kant, you have to sapere aude culture. Sapere aude, like think for yourself. Don't rely on tradition. Even consciously oppose tradition and do your own thoughts. Power your own path of knowledge. And that, in his most famous poem, Baratashvili says that my horse, like his figuratively presents his thinking like his stallion. His horse is running on the untrodden paths. He goes somewhere where nobody before him went. And that's what you should do. So for him, what he learned from Solomon Dodashvili was that what Europe did, Europe dared to go to these places where nobody was before, to build something totally new through your emancipation of your inner conscience. And this Enlightenment tradition became the kernel of building new Georgian identity in 19th century, when creators of Georgian nation, like Ilya Čaučavadze, Akaki Tsereteli, this generation of younger intellectuals, younger poets who call themselves Terek Daleulni, which means that those who have drunk from river Terek. So they had to go to St. Petersburg, and before going to St. Petersburg, they had to cross the river Terek. So they have drunk from the river Terek, means that they have drunk from European culture, because they went there to read European books. They came to Georgia with these new ideas of Europe, saying these Hegelian ideas that we should not be a Chinese civilization which turns like a circle and does only that which their ancestors have done. But we should be a European civilization which is like a spiral, which repeats something of the past, but also goes to the future, which was not before at all. So something totally new is happening in the future, and we have to build our own unknown future. And we are responsible for building our own future. And not only cultural future, but political future. And this Terek Daleulni tried to understand these processes of happening in Europe. What was happening in Europe? This great emancipation of labor, emancipation of women, and emancipation of younger nations from the ruins of empires. New nations were appearing there with sometimes with revolutions. Italy, Hungary, Czechia, and these kind of new European nations. And they saw it, prefigured it, that Russian Empire will also be ruined sooner or later. And we have to prepare ourselves for becoming one of the European nations. Like we see little nations coming to fore in Europe, we should become part of this process. And their idea was that we Georgians have great things in the past which we can use for the future. We are a Christian civilization, we retain our Christian identity, and Christianity is a religion of freedom, and now we are joining this free world. Again, they use these liberal ideas of liberal ideas of the West in a very Christian vestment. They understand Georgians had long Middle Ages. It was not like in Europe when Middle Ages could be finished like in the 15th, 16th century when the Renaissance started. Georgian Middle Ages were longer, until 18th century. But these new enlighteners, therefore, are introducing these enlighteners' ideas, enlightened ideas of French enlighteners, of these new political ideas of Hobbes and Locke, of Hegel, of Rousseau. They're introducing those ideas in a very religious form. They're speaking about the Christian social culture, but already based on emancipated human conscience. So not already that they speak about this public Christianity. You are a good Christian through your emancipated inner conscience. And they call it, Ilya Chaudhary calls it, our little God indwelling in us, which is our conscience. And once he says paradoxically that, for instance, when we have these Muslim Georgians united to this Georgian territory after Russian-Turkish war, even those Muslim Georgians can be in a public way good Christians, because if they are conscientious people and they serve their nation, that is what our Lord Jesus says that you are doing and showing your Christianity through your deeds. So these Muslim Georgians, even being not confessionally Christians, are good Christians through following their inner voice of conscience in a public space. So that's very new visions on Christianity. So again, they try to combine this idea of Christian sacrificial life with these modernist European ideas. And they really built a new nation of Georgians. This Terdaleuli, this project of this younger 19th century intellectual, still are at work, still is at work. When you say, why are you Georgians? They say, because Ilya Chaudhary coined this understanding of Georgians, in which these differences of class differences between noblemen and peasants is annihilated, somehow is surmounted by this understanding that we both are Georgians, both peasants and noblemen, and also the differences between different parts of Georgia is surmounted by understanding that Gurians, Megrelians, Swans, all are Georgians, all participate in one meta-culture. And this meta-culture is democratic culture. They created this idea of new Georgian meta-narrative, which is done in the language accessible for everybody. Before 19th century, there was a different language for noblemen, different language for peasants. They could not understand each other, but these intellectuals created a journalistic, a press language for all Georgians, which was a middle type of language, had its lofty elements retained, but also had public, peasant elements introduced into it, and it became kind of a uniting language for all Georgians of all social strata. Of course, you have the dissemination of Marxist ideas by the end of 19th century, and Marxists were against this project because Marxist idea was that class relationship and class belonging is more important than national belonging. That's why probably they killed Ilya Chaudhary, because he was spoiling for them, hindering for them this Marxist revolutionary process of this proletariat coming to rule the world, and the classes clashing against each other. For Ilya Chaudhary was not for clash, but for making a Georgian political nation in which different strata of society would fight for one aim of free Georgia. Some questions? Sorry, because I spoke too much. Hey, please.
Maybe I'm again not in the right time with my question, but I was wondering that Georgia as the name is originated, where it comes from. I understand Svaneti, I understand Inuiti, but the Georgia, as you were saying, that's a mega culture, where the word Georgia comes from.
Sakartvelo, yeah? Or Georgia itself.
Yeah, I understand.
All right. I mean, Sakartvelo, Kartli, Georgia itself, it's difficult to say because there are different ideas about it. Some people think that it's a Greek word for Gorgas, which means agriculturist. And they saw that Georgians are people who work with the land, and that's why they're Georgoi, or agriculturists. This is one of the explanations. So, some more romantic explanation is that the Georgians' most important saint is Saint George, and that's why they are called like people of Saint George. But I'm not sure about it. Another is that Gurg means wolves, and perhaps Persians in Persian, and Persians called us wolves, and that's why the Gurgs, and from there this Georgia came. And Gorgas, I don't know, Vachtan Gorgasali is a wolf and lion, and Gurg is wolf, and perhaps they had some military attire connected with symbol of wolves, and maybe Persians call them Gurg, who knows. It's a difficult issue.
And then the Russian Gruzin?
Gruzin, I think it also comes from Gurg.
Also.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
But Georgian self-name is Kartveli, and not Georgia. And Iberes also, they took it from Greeks, that we are Iberia or Iberia. The Greeks call us Ivires, like in Byzantine pronunciation. But the Sakartvelo, Kartli, became a word uniting all Georgians already in the 18th century. You can speak about it, but before you can this Kartli, as I told you, Kartli in 8th century already, no, not 8th, 9th century text, you read that Kartli is that land, that large territory in which liturgy is served in Georgian language. So Kartli. But this was religious identity. But in 19th century, end of 18th century, 19th century, it became a national identity already. National identity name. Kartli became name for all Georgians. Megrelians, Imeretians, Gurians, they all should have understood themselves as Kartlians. Kartvelni. Sakartvelo. Sakartvelo became a word uniting, word of surmounting differences. So, and that's why this term even was forbidden in Russian Empire, because they felt that it was a separatist term. This was term as launched against Russian assimilatory policies in Georgia. So that's why when Ilya Ceaușescu first started to issue Sakartvelos Moambe, a journal Sakartvelo, and then Russian censorship forbade it, and then they had to issue a newspaper called Iveria, not Sakartvelo. So Iveria was not forbidden, but Sakartvelo was forbidden. Yeah, please.
About the language, I'm just curious about literacy rate in the middle century and then also modern period, because it's language is one of the things like to identify who you are, and then also with your explanation that
and also writings, because writings come from 5th century, and in writings you have self-identity of Georgians. They construct themselves through writings. Yeah.
But it's like it's owned by only intellectual or widely spread, people
in Middle Ages or
Middle Age, and then any changes or
now, I mean, you know,
no, of course.
in Middle Ages. In Middle Ages, of course, literacy was not spread, and simple people mostly were illiterate. But noblemen, they read a lot. Yeah, you have this, as I told you, you were not here, I guess, in the beginning, but I told you already in 9th century, there was a church council in which bishops forbade laymen to interpret Bible and teach their serfs, because they had to go to bishops, communicate to them their own findings, their own ideas about Christian texts, and only then bishops could communicate it to the people, and they themselves were forbidden to do the same, because they were traveling a lot, and they were traveling in foreign monasteries, finding some new ideas there and bringing them back to their serfdom, so to say, and in their serfdom they were spreading these new ideas, and church found it important to forbid it in a doctrinal way, so to say, in an official, formal way. There was not this problem of too much alienation of religious texts from this laic culture, because high noblemen, tawad we call them, and the aznaurs and low noblemen, they were literate and they read a lot, and these texts were available for them. They were themselves writers and men of letters. In Latin Christianity, it's more like the Christianity and Christian text, since it is in Latin, it's only relegated to little layer of scholars who are mostly monks. In Georgia, it was more widespread, for sure.
When it was institutionalized at the learning,
Yeah, sure. It's monasteries were centers of learning, and in monasteries, not only monks were educated, laymen were given there, laymen children were given there, and they were provided education there. Sometimes even in Georgian monasteries, let's say in Byzantium, Byzantine noblemen and emperor were sending their children, please educate them, you are holy monks, and we kind of entrust our children to be educated under your guidance. Not as monks, as later to be the servants of Byzantine Empire. So monasteries were not simply centers of Christian, Christian devotion of this monastic devotion, but also general culture. In monasteries, you copied not only Christian books, but also philosophical books, some non-Christian literature as well. You have this, in Gelati school I told that there were these philosophical writings, Aristotle, Plato, Neoplatonics translated and commented. So it was a centers of general education. They had this trivium quadrivium system in Georgia as well, when you learn this mathematical discipline in Gelati, like first logical discipline, so to say. It was, grammatical discipline. First three disciplines were grammar, rhetoric, logic, and then this mathematical discipline, arithmetics, geometry, music, and astronomy. This, you see that in Gelati such disciplines were taught. There were propedeutics for learning more higher realms of knowledge, like dialectics and philosophy. You have this patently Western type education in Georgia at the time. Some of the questions, no? Okay, so this, I spoke about 19th century, and Georgia became, their work was very important because Georgia was really prepared after collapse of, ruining of, demise of, let's say, Russian Empire. Georgia was prepared as a political nation, that they could build a political nation. They could make Georgia a state, because Ilya Chochodze and his generation worked a lot in creating this Georgian identity and Georgian cultural and political identity, that we are the ones who can take the cross of history, so to say, and become one of the states among other European states. And Georgia became this one of the states in 1918. We had first democratic republic, and very democratic constitution, European constitution, and in his opening words, Noé Jordania says that we are taking to Europe, to our house, to our family, this 2,000 years culture. And unfortunately, this was short-lived, and we became part of Soviet Empire. Yeah? But still, European culture was very important, even in Soviet Georgia. You have in Soviet Georgia, Georgian poets imitating French poets. You have entire movements of blue horns, it's called. Blue horns were symbolic poets who were translating French poets like Mallarmé, Baudelaire, and Arthur Rimbaud, and trying to imitate their forms and creating new Georgian language, poetical language. We have Georgian writing of 20th century, beautiful writing based on European novelists, and they try to find out, and they have reflect in these novels about Georgian identity, speaking that yes, we were not part of these turbulent European developments and processes, but still we retained our capacity to unite Europe afterwards because we retained our Christian identity. At least we were good in heroically keeping up with Christianity, which eventually became our bridge to Europe. They're discussing who we are, like, yeah, we should imitate Europe because look at the Germans living in Imereti, what a nice houses they built, what a good habits of work do they have. Let's imitate them. We should be like Europeans. This also, you had these movements against communist rule, especially in the 80s, and when the Soviet Union was ruined, we had this first Georgian government in 1990 with Gamsakhourdia as the president. Of course, Gamsakhourdia was himself bearer of European culture, but he became very much, how to say, yeah, I mean, nationalist and chauvinistically so in a way, because in his discourse, Georgian was for Georgians, and there was the idea that other ethnicities in Georgia are guests here, these kind of ideas. And also there was this attempt of creating new type of ideological language when Soviet ideology was already not popular and became annihilated somehow. There was the idea that this should be substituted by new nationalistic ideology, and Gamsakhourdia was this constructor of this new nationalistic ideology. But this didn't work here because there was big democratic traditions also in Georgia, and we had a wonderful philosopher, Merab Mamardashvili, for instance, who fought against these tendencies. He was saying that, you know, we are European nation, and in European nation, if you are a European nation, you should understand that the ability to think, analyze, the logos, or the philosophical way of attitude to reality, the search for truth is more important than any nationalistic agenda. Patriotism is a great value, but greater value is your personal search for truth. And this personal search for truth, the sapere aude tradition of Immanuel Kant, cannot be subjected to any agenda, any political or nationalistic agenda. And he said this, that patriotism is a great value, but truth is even greater value. And if my nation will choose Gamsakhourdia's new ideological world, so to say, structure, then I'll go against my own nation. That the strong words he said, and that's why he was acclaimed to be a traitor of his nation. So, but he was for this European tradition of sapere aude, when nothing traditional is not overpowering you somehow, and not hindering your inner voice of free conscience. Today, Georgia's challenge is what do we see in Europe, and what does it mean for Georgians to integrate into Europe? All Georgian political parties are speaking about the same thing, that we are for European house and we are returning to Europe, we are aspiring towards Europe, the same level of life we are aiming at, same values, human values, law of law, these rights of human person, his protection of his private space. All this is said, but still a lot of wounds are there in the Georgians now. We speak those things sometimes as slogans, but in reality we do not fulfill, we are not living up to these slogans, and they are like slogans sometimes. In general ways, yes, we understand what Europe is, but there is lacking this great Enlightenment work at schools, at universities, when this European culture of sapere aude becomes your very essence, so to say. You are not trying to imitate Europe simply as you do not have anything of yourself, and you are embracing Europe as something good. You are zero, and Europe is everything. That is a wrong attitude. As I told you, there are so many things happening in Georgia that resonate with European culture in the past. And Ilia Ceaușescu's project was important and successful. Why? Because he took all these good things which he found in the past of Georgia in a Hegelian way. Because Hegel says that you should find rational kernel, rational seed in the past and take this seed for the future. Because you're not starting good things from the empty space. You are starting good things from something good which you already have. Today's Georgian challenge is not to look at ourselves in a nihilistic way, to retain very important things of our tradition, traditionality, and also embrace Europe and all the best things which you see in Western developments. Sometimes, since this is not taken so, and sometimes this Europe is presented in a shallow way, as a way of slogan, some part of Georgians revolt against it with blind traditionalism. Because they do not want to be nihilistically European in this way that I'm zero and I'm embracing something totally new. These globalization processes without losing myself in it. Another extreme is snobbish Europeanism, which does not regard anything which we have already in our 2,000 years culture as something important. So something new, Ilia Ceaușescuian type of synthesis is important now. You see what's happening sometimes in the name of Europeanization. There can be some very bad thing happening. It's a modernism at expense of human rights. It's possible. That's how this previous government is criticized, because they saw that you can violate human value, but we are going to modernize Georgia that it may become a full-fledged European country in a very rapid way, as a shock therapy way. But then if human rights are violated, what is Europe with frightened people? How can frightened people enter the Europe? That's a problem, yes? So there is a big deal to be done, and I think a big deal is to be done in Enlightenment way. To teach Georgians what in their culture resonated in great processes which brought European civilization. What is European civilization in its steps? What was Renaissance? What was Enlightenment? How it is expressed in modern European life? What is modernism? What is postmodernism? Because sometimes these snobbish Georgian intellectuals bring this postmodern Europe to Georgians who have not lived even modernist in a normal way. And immediately this postmodernism is very undigestible sometimes. And they do not speak to people at large. They speak only to little circle of intellectuals who speak to themselves only, and not to the people at large. So big Enlightenment project is necessary. Also churches should be, Enlightenment should come to churches as well, because sometimes in church there are these retrograde attitudes which thinks that these European processes are not in tune with orthodoxy. But how can Christianity be without European processes? When already Ilia Ceaușescu was speaking that you see that divine breathes in history, in historical processes, and all those processes, when you see emancipation of human being as such, when he does not belong to anybody as a commodity, or when women are provided the ways to participate in political processes, it's a very Christian thing, Christianity breathing in history. And this new type of understanding that you are responsible yourself for your own ideas, and you do not relegate your own ideas, your own responsibility to anybody else, even bishop or priest. That's without this, already Christianity cannot exist as authentic Christianity. Had not there been for Enlightenment, then yes, you could have this medieval style Christianity. But after Enlightenment, this genie of freedom, in metaphorical way, is out of the bottle already. You cannot pretend that it is inside bottle again. So authentic Christianity must be Christianity of Enlightenment, I think. And this should be taught that not in a way of ideology, but in a way of explanation and sincere belief, if one believes it sincerely, that Christianity is not against Enlightenment. And Enlightenment is product of Christianity. I'm not saying that Hegel and Kant and I don't know this Kierkegaard, they speak the same absolutely as let's say church fathers are speaking. There are great differences, but in attitude there is even church fathers. Had they lived in this era, they would be enlightened people of enlightenment, because enlightenment is not a local phenomenon, but enlightenment is a big phenomenon, humanitarian phenomenon of all humankind. And you cannot pretend that it didn't happen. And this is an important task, to unite these two things, that Enlightenment tradition of the West and this Georgian already existing tradition, and this courage to understand that you are standing in front of yet unknown world. There is no comfort zone that you may repeat everything and you are in a soft way, a soft style of life and serene style of life when everything is understandable. Nothing is understandable. European culture means that you are open to new challenges. And for new challenges, you are building new answers. And this is important for Georgians to develop this new attitude to reality, that we are responsible for our future. And future can be unknown. And for the unknown, you might be necessitated to build new structures, new attitudes. I think I can finish here now and wait for your questions.
I have a very short one.
Yeah, please.
Taking into account history of Georgia, there are some countries, because Europe is a concept, but in reality there are many Europes, because Germany is very different from Denmark, Portugal is very different from Greece,
Yeah.
and so on. There are some countries that Georgians feel like closer to them.
That's right.
For affinity, for
Yeah.
feelings. This was.
It's Georgians have this kind of Georgian are not like they have a certain type of carefreeness. There is this dimension of maybe this comes from still very strong Christian culture, still living in Georgian psyche. Very strong Christian culture which tells that this world is transient and eternity is larger than this world and its interests.
But I'm Italian,
yeah.
and I feel a lot of
easiness.
easiness.
There is more easiness and carefreeness. But I don't say that it's already altogether religious thing. But this religious sentiment is spread as a cultural givenness already. And I think Georgians have this kind of carefreeness. For instance, when Nicholas Baratashvili speaks about Georgian psyche, he says that Georgians are, in one of his verses, Georgians are such guys when they go to near Aragui bank of Aragui river and they see this beauty there. How can they withstand this urge not to stop their horse and go down, look at this beauty, drink wine 3 times at least, and then if they come late where they were going, it's nothing. So what then? So this kind of thing, that you should appreciate the life. Georgians would never say, like Heinrich Böll said once, that we Germans always prepare ourselves for life. We never live. It's not Georgian way. Georgian would like to live life. But sometimes to live life, it is at expense of creating, kind of becoming a self-made man and creating your own project of life. You are too much imbued with the soft manner of life, with your friends, with family, not really radically changing anything. And it's another problem. Maybe we need a bit more Germanhood to change something radically. But we are on the verge of this development. You see new Georgians now who are more active than previous generations and who are more adventurous maybe in this sense. So, but this is right. There is a certain softness and certain easygoing attitudes among Georgians. Also, there is very much traditional sentiments of keeping your friends to the end of your life, your school friends. It's not. It's difficult. You're not changing them, and also the family tradition is very tight. Family tradition. This kind of 3-generation families are in Georgia not exceptional things like in America or now also in Europe. But you see 3-generation families quite often in Georgia when grandmother and grandfathers are playing a very important role in raising children. And sometimes when Europeans come and see it, for them it's a kind of good miracle, so to say, good surprise. In American Academy, for instance, we had a director, Rick Lassen, and when we asked him what was most surprising for you in Georgia, he said, these 3-generation family. He told us that he was going to one house and there was 3-generation families. He thought it was anomaly. Then he saw it in another place, and then he thought, oh, it's something normal here. And he was very much pleased by seeing it, saying that this keeps this continuity of generations. When grandfathers and grandmothers are giving some tradition to their grandchildren, and then this continuity is kept. So you still have it here.
Yeah, from this point of view, there are also similarities
Yeah.
with the southern countries of Europe, like
Very much,
Portugal,
yeah.
Spain, Italy.
Very much so, yes. This Mediterranean culture is it's quite close to Georgia's. So that's why if you take what kind of Europe Georgia is, you may more compare it to this Mediterranean culture. My Armenian friend coined this term for Georgia and Armenia. We are Far Eastern Europe. So we are not Eastern Europe, we are Far Eastern Europe, but we are still Europe with our features. Of course, it will be disastrous if you will try to make Scandinavia out of Georgia. It will not fit to Georgian psyche. Once a Georgian man living in Holland, in Netherlands, wrote such a memory that he was invited in some kind of he was invited in a place and in a family, in a Dutch family, and he came there with some other guy, and this other guy was not invited, and he remembered that he was sat there, and the other guy was given some sofa somewhere else, so he was not sat in the place which was prepared only for 4 people or something, and for him it was kind of I don't know, apocalyptic thing, something. It's impossible in Georgia that somebody comes and a guest is not regarding, a host is not regarding this somebody who came without invitation as, I don't know, gift from God or something, and as responsible fully to host him. This tradition, this very ancient indigenous tradition of hospitality as something defining you is very important in Georgia. That's why I said that you cannot discard with these things, and you should not discard with these things. This tradition of friendship from school desk to the end of the life, for the rest of your life. This tradition of tight families, of course, not at the expense of freedom of kids. Freedom of kids. Sometimes it's a helicopter parenting, and there is too much of attention of parents and grandparents is also bad. But this is good thing when there is continuity of grandmother and grandfathers with the grandchildren, and that's why sometimes the grandchildren are more traditional than their parents because of influence of grandmother and grandfather. Especially in this world of globalization, when new values are not sometimes so noble values. These new values coming. It's these market values and values of success. They may not be such noble values as traditional values. And then when traditional values are kept, then you have some kind of antidote against this swiping new values. So in this sense, I think the Georgians are facing this challenge of keeping the best they have, and it's difficult to keep it, and also embrace the best Europe and West can offer. Thank you.